Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar hosted by the IRRC Institute and Board Governance Research on a new report, Age Diversity Within S&P 500 Boards. Our agenda today is introductions, an in-depth review of the research, a few words from the IRRC Institute on their perspective on the report, and then your questions. The logistics for the webinar today are as follows. All of the attendees are in listen-only mode, but we do encourage your questions. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions, just use your control panel and type your question into the question box. We'll read it aloud following the presentation and respond. We are recording this webinar, and you will receive an email with a link to listen to a replay of this or to share it with others who might be interested. If you're interested in sharing this information on social media, of course, we encourage that. Our Twitter handles are there at IRC Research and at Annalisa @_BGR. If you have any audio issues during the session, please contact GoToWebinar. They can be reached at 1-800-263-6317. We have two speakers today. The first is Annalisa Barrett, and she will be followed by John Lekumnik. Annalisa is a report author. She's also the founder and CEO of Board Governance Research, and she's a clinical professor of finance at the University of San Diego School of Business. She has nearly 2 decades of experience in the field of corporate governance, including positions at the Corporate Library, Towers Perrin, and Arthur Andersen. In 2008, she was named a Milstein Rising Star in corporate governance. Our second speaker today will be John Lekumnik, and he served as the executive director of the IRRC Institute since it was founded. Along with the board of directors, he's led the organization to be a leading source of objective academic and practitioner research on a wide array of investment issues. He's got a lot of experience as an institutional investor, including time as the investment advisor to the New York City pension funds. And John also is the author of the new book, What They Do With Your Money, How the Financial System Fails Us and How to Fix It, published by Yale University Press. A few words on the IRRC Institute if you're not familiar with the organization. Again, it's a nonprofit that funds and disseminates objective, unbiased research on a whole range of issues of importance to investors. It's both academic and practitioner research. We sponsored annual research award for the best research in the field, 2 $10,000 awards, and that's toward the end of the year. And there's more than 60 research reports available at no charge on the website, and we encourage you to take a look at those as well. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Annalisa. Annalisa?
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really excited to share with you the findings from our new research, and I'm very thankful to the IRRC Institute for sponsoring this research. The question underlying this research project is related to the conversation that many directors, companies, and institutional investors are having around the country and around the world, which is looking at the diversity of the members of the board of directors. And many studies, both academic and practitioner, have found that there are benefits from having diverse directors sitting around the boardroom table. And most of those studies actually focus on gender or possibly other aspects of diversity. This study is focusing on the age of the directors. Now, we do have a lot of studies and statistics regarding the age of directors. For example, a recent IRC study conducted by ISS was focused on director demographics and found that nearly 3/4 of S&P 1500 directors are in their 50s and 60s. And that's consistent with many other studies that have been done looking at the directors who serve on S&P 500 or 1500 or Russell 3000 boards as a group of directors. The difference in this study is that we're looking at the age diversity within each boardroom. So on each board, what are the different ages of the directors represented around the table? So this is a benchmarking study. We didn't take the step of looking at correlation to firm performance or board effectiveness. We're just looking at the current state of age diversity within corporate boardrooms. And the thinking there is that similar to other aspects of director demographics and board diversity, people with different ages bring different experiences and just different perspectives to the boardroom. And so, for example, a younger person serving as a director may be more comfortable with social media and may understand how people who are younger may access the company, make purchases, make purchasing decisions, that type of thing. Older directors may bring other types of experience to the boardroom. But with millennials having overtaken baby boomers as the largest generation, this is an area where directors, and investors may want to consider evaluating the diversity of the board. So our first slide shows the average age of the board, which is one way to look at each group, each individual board group. And we find that, not surprisingly, given the fact that most directors are in their 50s and 60s, we also find that the average age of each board is in their 50s and 60s. And you see, so in fact, 80% of the board has an average, 80% of the S&P 1500 or S&P 500 boards have an average age in the 60s. And there are very few outliers. Only 2% have an average age in the 70s or less than 55 years old. However, the average age doesn't tell the whole story. However, I will tell you a little bit on the next slide about some of the kind of outliers when it comes to average age. We have listed here on the slide, on slide 9, the two S&P 500 companies that have an average board age that is younger than 50 years old. One is Facebook, as you see, with an average board age of 49 years, which isn't as surprising given the fact that the founder and several of the founding members of the company and board are very young. But TripAdvisor is another company. It actually has the lowest average board age in the study at 48.6 years. Now, most of the directors, in fact, at the TripAdvisor board are very concentrated around that average age, which we'll talk about a little bit later. On the other hand, the oldest average board age in the study was 75.5 years, and that is CBS Corp. And the striking thing there is that even without Sumner Redstone, who was a 92-year-old director, the average age of that board is still very high at 74.2 years. So as I said, average age doesn't really tell us the whole story because it doesn't tell us the dispersion of the ages of the directors or how many different age groups are represented in the boardroom. So those were the next things that we considered. On the next slide, you can see the results of the study of the examination of the standard deviation of the ages of the directors within each boardroom. And of course, standard deviation is a way to measure the extent to which the ages of the directors on each board are dispersed around that average age. So presumably, a board with a higher standard deviation of ages would have a more diverse group of ages represented. So interestingly though, we find a very kind of tight group of standard deviations among the S&P 500 boards. So, 62% of the S&P 500 boards have a standard deviation between 5 and 8. So there's not a wide variety there. Of course, the minimum and maximum are outliers, with one boardroom having a standard deviation of the ages of the directors at only 3, and the maximum, the most diverse when it comes to standard deviation of director ages, was at 17. But on average, the standard deviation was 7.2. So again, a pretty tight cohort of director ages around the mean. Another way to look at it, you can see on the next slide, is by looking at the number of decades represented on each board. So again, with the thinking that people who were born in different decades and who have very different life experiences during their growing up years and formative experiences with different types of access to technology or different types of interest in different issues at different stages of life, we broke it down by decade to understand the presence of um, different age groups represented in each board. So the chart here shows the number of companies or the percentage of the S&P 500 with 2 decades represented among the ages of the directors, 3 decades, 4 decades, etc. And as you can see, over half of the S&P 500 boards have 3 decades represented in their boardroom. And most commonly, again, not surprisingly, given the prevalence of 60 and 50-year-old directors, those 3 decades were in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. So again, a large percentage of the boardrooms have 3 decades represented, and most commonly those decades were 50s, 60s, and 70s. There are some outliers, as you can see. 13% of the S&P 500 companies have only 2 decades represented in their boardroom. So very few different ages represented in that boardroom when you look at age grouped by decade. And a few companies in the study have 5 or 6 decades represented on their board. And so these are the companies with a very wide representation of different generations in the boardroom. On the next slide, you can see some examples of the companies in these categories. As mentioned, 13% or 6,500 of the S&P 500 boards have only 2 decades represented in their boardrooms. Some notable examples among those 65 are listed below. You can see Apple is among them, Procter & Gamble, Target, and Urban Outfitters. They all have only 2 decades represented in their boardroom, and those decades are 50s and 60s. So their directors are only in the age range from 50 to 69. As mentioned earlier, TripAdvisor is an interesting one because it has the lowest average board age of everyone in the S&P 500, of all the boards in the S&P 500. And they are the directors on that board are only between the ages of 40 and 59, so only 2 decades represented among the directors on that board. Excuse me. The other outliers on the other extreme have 6 decades represented in the boardroom, and that would be from the 30s through the 80s most typically. And the 3 boards are listed here. Kraft Heinz, News Corp, and Viacom are those boards. Now, interestingly, this may be an area for further study because, of course, several of the boards that have a high number of decades represented on the board are controlled companies or companies where there are a high percentage of those companies are controlled. So companies where there may be representatives from a family group, different generations from that family group represented in the boardroom, as is the case with Viacom and News Corp. The next study that we did, or the next way that we broke down the data, was to think about whether or not there is a difference in age diversity among the different boards by industry. This would be one area where you may expect to see some differences, given that it may be, you may presume that, maybe information technology companies are targeting a younger audience with their products, or there may be different industries that may have targets either customer audiences, or employees that they are focused on younger or older generations. However, we don't see, as you can see here in the chart, almost any difference when it comes to at least average age, when the S&P 500 companies are broken down by industry. Only at the minimum and maximum levels do you see really any variation there. We do see on the next slide, though, slight amounts of differentiation when we looked at the companies broken down by industry. And here we looked at it instead of by average board age, we did the study looking at the number of decades represented in the boardroom. And as you can see, although the differences are relatively minor, the consumer discretionary and consumer staples industries were slightly more likely to have 5 or more decades represented on their boards. You can see at the other extreme, the industry that was more likely to have only 2 decades represented were utilities and energy. So again, the differences are minor, but you can see that there is some variation in terms of the number of decades represented in the boardroom or number of age groups represented in the boardroom when we look at industry. So since that didn't find as much variation as we might have expected, we did do some additional cuts of the S&P 500 to see if there were any differences by other ways to break down the companies. On the next slide, you can see the results of the comparison by company size. So we broke down the companies by market capitalization just into 3 main categories, over 25 billion, between 10 and 25 billion, and then under 10 billion. Remember, these are S&P 500 companies, so those numbers will be high no matter what. But as you can see in the findings here, again, there's very slight differences. The smaller companies were slightly more likely to have 3 decades represented. The larger companies, the larger 2 categories, the companies that were a little bit larger, over 10 billion, are slightly more likely to have 4 decades represented. But the differences are very minor, and we looked at the average board age. Those were also very similar as well, with all of the the median average board age for each industry falling between 62 and 63. So company size does not seem to be a big indicator of the presence of a diverse group of ages in the boardroom. The next slide, though, however, finds some interesting findings by looking at the age of the company. So the age of the company we defined as how many years since the company's IPO. So how long had the company been publicly traded? And this data was available for a portion of the S&P 500 that we included in the study. And you can see here just slight differences that more recent IPOs were more likely than the other companies, more recent in terms of having gone public within the past 25 years. So, not new IPOs, but compared to the 3 groups, the most recent. And they were the most likely to have 4 or 5 decades represented on their boards. Whereas the older companies, over 50 years old, so having been public for over 50 years, they were the most likely to have 2 decades represented. So presumably a less age diverse boardroom for those companies. So we did find some difference there. The findings from all of these studies led to the question, there's so much focus on board diversity, and one of the kind of corollary discussions that takes place regarding board construction and board composition is turnover. Is board refreshment going to increase the diversity of the boardroom? And so one of the questions that we asked was, is recent board turnover increasing the age diversity of the companies in the S&P 500? So in order to study this, we created a subset of the S&P 500 by taking the 5 largest companies in each of the 11 GICS industry categories. And we use that as our kind of subset of the S&P 500. As you can imagine, that represents the largest kind of capitalization market cap of within the S&P 500 by choosing those largest companies within each category and an equal representation with each industry. And then we examined the director changes that had been made at those 55 boards over the last 2 years to see if the companies that had more board changes, more director changes over the past 3 years, actually had a more diverse board as a result of those director changes. However, the finding, as you can see in the chart on this slide, the finding was somewhat surprising in that the standard deviation of the ages of the directors at the boards that had more director changes actually were more likely to decrease. So we found that the companies that had 4 or more director changes were actually more likely to have a decrease in their age diversity as measured by standard deviation rather than an increase. So this seems to be, this finding tells me that there seems to be, an opportunity for boards to think about age diversity as they are refreshing their boards. And that doesn't seem to be part of the process that's being considered, part of the issues that are being considered when companies are focusing on bringing in new directors as a result of a director change. So, those are the kind of findings from the study and the analysis. And now I will turn it over to John Lakumnik from the IRC Institute for his thoughts on the takeaways from the research report.
Thank you, Annalisa, for the research, and thank everyone for being on the line. This is an overused example, but it seems appropriate to this. It's the curious incident of the dog in the night where the dog did nothing, and from an old Sherlock Holmes story. And Sherlock Holmes points out that the fact that the dog did nothing is curious, and I think that is really the news in this study. Next slide, please. Because sometimes the news is what you don't find. And in this case, it is, some of these are intuitive, but some are counterintuitive. There is little variety in average age across boards overall. There's little difference in average age of boards by industry. You would have thought perhaps tech would skew a little younger, or market capitalization. 80% of boards' average age is in the 60s. Less than 2% of average age is an outlier. And then some of the dispersion stats, there's small dispersion in age within boards. All board members tend to be within 10 to 15 years of each other. And the most interesting finding to me, the counterintuitive one, is the last one that Annalisa mentioned, which is that despite the focus on refreshment, and some of the people on the call today, I suspect, were on the last board study call we did, which found that refreshment has increased and that more diversity by gender. The most recent classes of director, still below what most people would think would be appropriate, but substantially up from where it was. Refreshment doesn't seem to affect age dispersion. Indeed, it seems to tighten the dispersion rather than widen it, which would lead you perhaps to think, Annalisa put it, that there's an opportunity there. I would put it that the preconceived ideal of what people are looking for in a director, they're still looking for people at 55 to 65 years old. Next slide, please. With that, I will just turn it over to Kelly for any questions from the audience. Thanks much.
Terrific. Thanks so much, John and Annalisa. We're now on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. And as a reminder, if you have questions, there's a question box in your control panel. Just type your question in there. I'll read it aloud, and John and/or Annalisa can respond. So it looks like our first question is this. One of the concerns regarding putting younger people on boards is that they may stay on the board for too long, which could raise issues regarding long tenured directors' independence. Did you look at director tenure in relation to director age?
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah. In fact, we did look at that because that is, one of the issues that is brought up quite often when thinking about adding younger directors to boards. And so I looked at the directors who have been on their boards for 10 years or more, and found that 77% of them, so the majority of them, joined those boards when they were in their 40s or 50s. So in fact, that does seem to indicate that directors who are in their 40s or 50s, at least in the past, directors who are in their 40s and 50s when they join the board tend to stay on the board for 10 years or longer, which, in some circumstances and for some institutional investors, has been a threshold at which independence becomes a question. And so that does seem to be the case. So again, that does seem, in my mind, that's an opportunity for boards to think about directors who are coming on the board at younger ages and how they can be evaluated effectively and not consider board service something that continues on indefinitely, but continues until that director is or is not continues to be effective as a board member, whether that's because of other things going on in their lives or the skill sets that they're bringing to the board matching the needs of the company.
Let me just add that in the last study that we did find a direct correlation between the few companies that do not do any board evaluations, or at least do not disclose any board evaluation, and tenure. The tenure of those companies is longer. It's an outlier. I believe it was more than 11 years on average. And for those of you who don't think 11 years is a long time, let me point out that that's 1 year longer than smartphones have existed. So if you think about the average director of a company that doesn't do a board evaluation being selected prior to mobile computing, smart media, being able to purchase mobilely, which is where most purchasing is going, you can see how the skill set might vary. So I don't think the issue is we shouldn't select younger directors otherwise qualified because they may stay too long. I think the question is, what is the board evaluation process and the refreshment process? And tenure is a separate issue to be dealt with by a nominating governance committee functioning well and having a robust board evaluation policy.
Thank you. Our next question is a lot of this possibly explained by the deep experience needs and availability of people with sufficient time, for example, retired individuals that's required to serve on a board?
Yes, definitely, and this is something to consider. Whether or not the board is looking for a group of people who are all in that category and all in that same stage of life and experience level, or if a variety of some people who are at the beginning or middle of their executive level career, some people who are at the end of their executive level career, and some people who are currently retired and have that time. From what a lot of conversations I've been having with boards and directors specifically on this issue recently, there seems to be an agreement, at least the directors I've spoken to, that having a mix of both retired and fully employed people serving in the boardroom is valuable. And so I definitely think that very well could explain the current state and the kind of picture that we're seeing here in the data. But I don't think that that's a reason to not consider people who are fully employed or may have a different experience, different type of full-time employment as well. As we know, millennials and younger people are approaching, many studies have found that they're approaching work in a very different way, and full-time employment to them means something very different than being an executive in the C-suite at a large company. And so maybe that experience is valuable for to bring a different perspective to the boardroom as well. But I definitely do think it does explain, based on traditional expectations of what board members should look like, the numbers that we're seeing today.
Thank you. Our next question, is there any academic evidence that age diversity leads to better decision-making or better performance among boards?
So I didn't find any as I searched for that. I did find a few studies that had not been published. So a few that were, more in the preliminary stage or that didn't make it to the publishing stage. But there didn't seem to be much focus on this issue, specifically looking at the diversity of the ages of the directors within the boardroom, within each board. So I definitely think that this is something to consider for further research, to look at, do some correlations for effectiveness regarding, outcomes in financial performance, as well as the other measures of effective board governance that have been done in other director demographic studies, such as, the impact on risk oversight or the impact on innovation and globalization, those types of questions that have been addressed with gender issues, gender diversity on boards. I think it would be a great idea for someone to take that study on.
Thank you. Our next question, why do you think there are fewer decades on smaller company boards? And do those boards skew younger or older?
So I think one of the challenges there is that quite often smaller company boards have fewer directors. Now, I didn't look at it in terms of the size of the board for this study, and these are all S&P 500 companies. So presumably, even though you're in the smaller company category within this study, the companies are still very large because they are in the S&P 500. But overall, we tend to see fewer directors at smaller companies for a variety of reasons that are beyond the scope of this study. But that may very well be the issue, that there are fewer directors on the boards of those companies, and therefore, just by the sheer numbers, there are fewer decades represented as well.
Thank you. The next question. Do you look at how gender diversity relates to age diversity?
So we didn't include it in this study, but I did look at that just slightly. So I don't have that information right in front of me, but that would definitely be another avenue to take this information in this study as as I mentioned, this was meant to be somewhat of a benchmarking study to kind of understand where we are right now within this kind of narrow topic of age diversity within the boardroom. But I feel like there are a lot of different ways we could look at this. Certainly looking at the age diversity and gender diversity. One of the things we do know, just from the broader studies and it was confirmed in this data as well, but the broader studies of directors as a pool or as a group of, all directors of the S&P 1500 or 500, for example, is that female directors tend to be younger than male directors as a group. But I don't know how that would interplay with this, yet. I do have beginnings of that in my back end research, but not in the report. Another aspect that I looked at was the difference in the age between the board members and the CEO. Thinking about if the CEO is older or younger than the typical board member on his or her board, how does that impact the power play between the board and the CEO? So I think there are a lot of different directions we can take this now that we have this kind of benchmarking baseline to work with.
Just a general comment on the gender diversity, age diversity question. As Annalisa said, we not look at gender and age diversity. However, the previous study, which Annalisa referenced, which is also available, as is this one at ircinstitute.org, does look at women and age, as Annalisa said, for the S&P 1500 as a whole. And there is, in fact, a developing and increasing gender gap in terms of age and also tenure. And part of that is for a good reason, which is that the number of female directors being appointed to boards has increased materially in the last 2 years. So you would expect to have a 10-year gap because they're disproportionately in the newer classes. There is also a bit of an age gap that has developed. So one could postulate that all other things being equal, since the average age of directors has maintained, and we know that male directors have increased in age and female directors have decreased in age and tenure, that they would increase the diversity. But we haven't directly studied it. But if you look at the data in the other study, you can pretty well assume that there would be a marginal increase in age diversity with gender diversity because of when they have been appointed.
Thank you. Our next question. I realize the study looks at Fortune 500 companies, but does it have any relevance for smaller companies? What lessons can they take away from this study?
I like that question. Yeah, so I think that one of the lessons that I think should be taken away for all boards is just to start a conversation around age diversity as an aspect of diversity as you're considering it for your boardroom. And so I think, again, we don't have the correlation to performance, but just as, intuitively as we're thinking about increasing diversity of the boardroom as a whole, having an age component be part of that that consideration is something that it seems to me is an opportunity that isn't being considered now, or at least isn't being implemented now. So that's one thing. Otherwise, there are a lot of differences between the governance practices in larger companies than in smaller companies that have been found and are shown quite dramatically and effectively in the ISS study that IRC released last month or month and a half ago. So I would definitely direct you to that study to look at the comparisons between the different S&P groups to see some of those differences as well. But in terms of the lesson overall, I think all boards would benefit from at least considering directors of different ages in their candidate pool and going from there to select the director that makes the most sense for the board at the time.
Our next question, did you discover anything in TripAdvisor's disclosures or in conversations that provided any indication as to why the age is skewed relatively younger?
That's a great question, and no, I didn't. I didn't look at proxies as I would for for other types of studies. I didn't look at them. I only look at them for the 55, not the entire 500. But that's a great question. I'd love to look at that. So thanks for the suggestion.
The next question, which board had the lowest standard deviation of ages and the highest?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I showed the lowest average and highest average, but I can tell you the lowest standard deviation was 3, as shown in the slide, and that company that has only a standard deviation of 3 is Devon Energy, so an energy company, and I think some of the other findings indicated that energy companies and utility companies are among those that have the least age diversity. The highest standard deviation was 17, and that was Kimco Realty, a real estate company. Berkshire Hathaway was also high on the list, but not the highest. So those are the two outliers when it comes to the standard deviation assessment.
Thank you. And let's see, do we have one more question? No. It looks like we have concluded answering all of our questions. So we thank everyone for those insightful questions. And we thank you all for participating in the session. If you have any follow-up questions, of course, John and Annalisa are available at your convenience to respond to those. This PowerPoint presentation will be posted on the IRC website by tomorrow, as will a replay of this webinar. Again, thank you so much for your participation, and please let us know if we can answer any further questions. Thank you.